Hello, and welcome to another episode of It's a History podcast. I am your host, Madison, and this week we are going to be looking at the history of hot air balloons. You may be surprised to hear that hot air balloons and hot air ballooning have been around for over 2 centuries, with the first iterations of the hot air balloon coming about in the late 18th century. Today, there are 2 main types of balloons flown, the hot air balloons and the gas balloons. Both types of balloons use something called an envelope that holds either the hot air or gas. With hot air balloons, flight is achieved by there being hotter air in the envelope than the outside. With the gas balloons, the envelope is filled with a type of lifting gas, either hydrogen or helium, though they both can be used. Hydrogen is used more often than helium due to its cheaper cost and its wider availability than helium. Modern hot air balloons mostly use propane, but we'll look into that a little bit more later. To get to this point, we have to look at where we started with the first hot air balloon, so let's get right into it. Prior to the airplane, ballooning was the only way to travel by air, and the years of ballooning were very important to many human advancements, especially with travel, mapping, research, and the military. In 1882, 2 brothers, Jacques and Joseph Montgolfier, after noticing that if a light paper bag was filled with smoke, it would eventually rise to the sky. With that knowledge, the brothers would build an oblong light paper bag with about 40 cubic feet of capacity to test their experiment. With an opening at the bottom of the bag, when heat was applied underneath it, the bag rose 75 feet into the air. With the success of this first experiment, they made their next experiment on a much larger scale. This second experiment now had 600 cubic feet in capacity and was now a spherical shape instead of rectangular. The shape was actually inspired by a short-necked glass bottle that is used in chemistry that is called a balloon. When they applied heat to the second experiment, it was able to ascend to 600 feet above the ground. With 2 successes under their belt, they went ahead with a third, much larger experiment. This third experiment was also a spherical paper balloon with a diameter of 35 feet and had 23,000 cubic feet capacity and could also lift up to 500 pounds. This third experiment was held on April 3rd, 1783, and would ascend to 1,000 feet and travel 3/4 of a mile. You might be wondering where 2 guys in France would get this much paper in the 1780s. Well, the brothers were actually sons of a wealthy paper manufacturer. After these successful experiments, Jacques was invited to the Royal Academy of Science to repeat this experiment at the expense of the Academy. Together, they constructed another large balloon, 72 feet high and 41 feet in diameter. The finished product would weigh over 1,000 pounds, and in preliminary experiments, the balloon managed to lift 8 men off the ground. They didn't go anywhere, just up and down. The first balloon flight was supposed to take flight on September 12, 1783, but due to high winds, a large gust damaged the balloon. A new balloon was immediately commissioned, and it was to be inflated in the presence of King Louis XVI and the royal family at Versailles. So just exactly when did this first balloon take flight? That would be September 19, 1783. The first passengers, at the suggestion of the king himself, were a rooster, a duck, and a sheep. The balloon was in the air for 15 minutes, with the animals reaching an altitude of 15,000 feet. The animals would land back on the ground safely, about 10,000 feet from the takeoff spot, making a successful passenger first flight, even if the first passengers were animals. Just 2 months later, in November 1783, man made its first balloon flight. The first 2 people to fly in a hot air balloon were Jean-François Pilotard de Rozier and the Marquis de Arlens. The pair launched their hot air balloon, which was made of paper and silk, by the brothers. They launched the balloon in Paris, and their flight was longer than the trio of animals, lasting just 20 minutes. While in flight, the pair experienced various wind currents and changes in the air temperature, and during this initial voyage, the balloon was at risk for catching on fire multiple times. Jean-François was prepared and did bring a pail of water and a sponge to put out any pesky flames. They were able to successfully raise and lower their altitude multiple times by controlling the fire. They did make a successful landing. This event was actually documented by Benjamin Franklin, famously a Francophile. At this point, you may be thinking, didn't the Chinese already have the jump on this technology? And while yes, the use of paper lanterns was well spread across China, using this technology to transport people had never been recorded. The first authenticated aerial voyages were the voyages made by the Montgolfier balloons. After the success of the hot air balloons, it would just be 10 days after this that the first gas balloon would make its maiden voyage. launched by physicists Jack Alexander Charles and Nicholas Louis Robert. The first flight of the gas balloon would also launch from Paris, France. It traveled significantly more than the first hot air voyage, with the first flight lasting 2.5 hours and traveling a distance of 25 miles. For this first gas balloon trip, they used hydrogen gas, which had been developed in 1776 by Englishman Henry Cavendish. 2 years later, in 1785, Jean-Pierre Blanchard, another French balloonist, and John Jefferson, an American, became the first people to ever fly over the English Channel. This first flight over the English Channel was actually made with a gas balloon rather than a hot air balloon. And this crossing was also marked as the longest distance that a balloon was ever flown and was a step in the right direction when it came to the possibility of long-distance balloon travel. Also in 1785, Pilotar de Rozier did unfortunately die while also trying to cross the English Channel. He had decided to use an experimental design and traveled with a hot air and gas balloon combo. His design was highly experimental, and in hindsight, mixing the very, very flammable hydrogen with actual fire was not the best decision. The balloon had exploded just 30 minutes after liftoff, killing both passengers on board. In 1793, Jean-Pierre Blanchard, a French military officer, became the first man to fly a hot air balloon in North America. And to my surprise, George Washington himself witnessed this launch. I don't often think of the Founding Fathers and hot air balloons existing in the same space, but here we are. This launch happened in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania from a prison yard. The balloon was able to reach an altitude of 5,800 feet and eventually made a successful landing in Gloucester County in New Jersey. For the next 150 years, the battle between hot air balloons and gas ballooning was overtaken by gas ballooning. Ballooning via hot air had pretty much been abandoned during this period. Gas balloons were more convenient and easier to fly than hot air balloons. Being fueled by gas, there was no need for fire to get them in the air, and with gas, they were able to stay in the air longer and could be controlled a little bit better than balloons powered by fire. Up until the invention of the airplane, gas balloons were the preferred method of air travel, and that air travel was rather limited to begin with. It was expensive and time-consuming to inflate balloons with gas to fly, so this form of travel was not for the everyman. Hot air balloons, with their dependence on a heat source, were just not dependable. In the United States, balloons were utilized during the Civil War. President Abraham Lincoln would commission 10 balloons from a commercial balloon company owned by Thaddeus Lowe. These 10 commissioned balloons would make 3,000 ascents and would be used to assess enemy positions from the air. In the early 1900s, blimps started to be built and acted as a sort of commercial aircraft carrier for a wider sect of the population versus the smaller, more wealthy subsect that could travel by gas balloon. Like the gas balloons, blimps were inflated and kept in the air with hydrogen gas, which, as I mentioned previously, is a highly flammable gas. In 1936, blimps were very popular and used in both civilian life as well as militarily. The biggest blimp to ever be made was the Hindenburg. It had been built in Germany in 1936, was 803 feet long and 135 feet wide. This blimp would hold 7 million cubic feet of gas. Famously, the Hindenburg would catch fire and burn in less than 1 minute while it was attempting to dock in Lakehurst, New Jersey. 35 of the 97 people on board were killed. After this disaster, the use of blimps began to wane rather quickly. Hydrogen gas was now considered to be too dangerous, and helium was still too expensive to inflate large vessels such as blimps. In the 1930s, Joseph Emmer made great strides in the history of ballooning and became the first person to inflate a balloon utilizing propane as the heat source, which would eventually lead us nicely to the 1950s, where a man named Ed Yost worked to revive ballooning by air by working up some designs that completely redesigned the fueling system for hot air balloons that would allow these balloons to fly for longer distances and be more maneuverable. His new design would utilize a propane gas burner that would make sustained flight in the balloon possible. On October 22, 1960, Ed Yost launched the first modern design of the hot air balloon in Bruning, Nebraska, in a flight that lasted 1 hour and 25 minutes. He traveled 3 miles. The balloon used to take this trip was 40 feet in diameter and had a volume of 30,000 cubic feet. This redesign had made hot air travel possible again, without the inconsistency of actual fire and the bad stigma that surrounded hydrogen. In 1963, to prove the practicality of hot air ballooning once again, Ed Yost and Don Picard, who was an experienced gas balloon pilot, traveled across the English Channel. with the English Channel being the original obstacle that hot air balloons successfully traversed. This was also the year that sport ballooning became popular. The first ever U.S. National Hot Air Balloon Championship was held in Kalamazoo, Michigan. This event has ballooned, pun intended, to local ballooning clubs across the United States. A vast majority of these balloons use hot air balloons, utilizing the new and improved designs with propane. Gas balloons are still used, but they are now inflated with helium instead of hydrogen. The helium still remains expensive, and it still takes longer to inflate a gas balloon, which has led to the popularity of hot air over gas in the modern times. When it comes to long-distance balloon travel, balloons are often inflated with a combination of hot air and gas, which, if you remember from the beginning of today's episode, had led to a fatal result when hot air balloons were inflated using fire. But now, with more advanced technology, balloons can be inflated with both. These balloons have 2 helium cells and 1 hot air cell. And if you thought an hour-and-a-half hot air balloon ride was long, just wait until you hear how long it took Richard Branson and Per Lindstrand to travel across the Atlantic in a hot air balloon. They flew the nearly 3,000 miles in 33 hours. But that is not the farthest, nor the longest hot air balloon flight. Branson and Lindstrand paired up one more time in 1991 to cross the Pacific Ocean, traveling from Japan to Canada. They flew 6,700 miles in 47 hours. And even then, one man, Steve Fawcett, in 2002, went on to circumnavigate the world using a dual hot air gas balloon. He launched from Western Australia and would make his way back to the Australian outback in 14 days, 19 hours, and 51 minutes. Gas balloons today are also used by NASA to conduct scientific research. These balloons are used similar to how we use satellites to study both deep space and Earth itself. But being a balloon and not an actual satellite, these gas balloons are much cheaper for NASA to operate. And with that, that's where I'm going to end today's episode. I hope you learned something new about the history of ballooning, both with hot air and gas. Sources for today's episode include an article titled A Brief History of Hot Air Ballooning from the Anderson Abruzzo International Balloon Museum Foundation, and an article from the National Balloon Museum titled History of Ballooning. Thank you for listening to this week's episode. If you liked what you heard, head over to Spotify or Apple Podcasts and leave a review. If you have any questions, comments, or topic ideas, you can email me at itsahistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also find me over on Instagram and Threads at It's a History Podcast. Thank you again for listening to this week's episode, and I hope to have you in the next one.